Hey comrades! So today we're reading the second chapter of the Wretched of the Earth called Spontaneity, Its Strength and Weakness. This consideration of violence has led us to take account of the frequent existence of a time lag or difference of rhythm between the leaders of a nationalist party and the mass of the people. In every political or trade union organization, there is a traditional gap between the rank and file, who demand the total and immediate bettering of their lot, and the leaders, who, since they are aware of the difficulties which may be by the employers, seek to limit and restrain the workers' demands. This is why you are often aware of a dogged discontent among the rank and file as regards their leader. After a day spent in demonstrating for their demands, the leaders celebrate the victory, whereas the rank and file have a strong suspicion that they have been cheated. It is through a multiplicity of demonstrations in support of their claims, through an increase in trade union demands, that the rank and file achieve their political education. A politically informed trade union member is a man who knows that a local conflict is not a decisive settlement between himself and the employers. The native intellectuals, who have studied in their respective mother countries the working of political parties, carefully organize similar institutions in order to mobilize the masses and bring pressure to bear on the colonial administration. The birth of nationalist parties in the colonized countries is contemporary with the formation of an intellectual elite engaged in trade. The elite will attach a fundamental importance to organization, so much so that the fetish of organization will often take precedence over a reasoned study of colonial society. The notion of the party is a notion imported from the mother country. This instrument of modern political warfare is thrown down just as it is, without the slightest modification, upon real life, with all its infinite variations and lack of a balance, where slavery, serfdom, barter, a skilled working class, and high finance exist side by side. The weakness of political parties does not only lie in the mechanical application of an organization which was created to carry on the struggle of the working class inside a highly industrialized capitalist society. If we limit ourselves to the type of organization, it is clear that innovations and adaptations ought to have been made. The great mistake, the inherent defect in the majority of political parties in underdeveloped regions has been, following traditional lines, to approach in the first place those elements which are the most politically conscious, the working class in the towns, the skilled workers, and the civil servants. That is to say, a tiny portion of the population, which hardly represents more than 1%. But although this proletariat has read the party publications and understood its propaganda, it is much less ready to obey in the event of orders being given which set in motion the fierce struggle for national liberation. It cannot be too strongly stressed that in the colonial territories the proletariat is the nucleus of the colonized population, which has been most pampered by the colonial regime. The embryonic proletariat of the towns is in comparatively privileged position. In capitalist countries, the working class has nothing to lose. It is they who in the long run had everything to gain. In the colonial countries, the working class have everything to lose. In reality, it represents the fraction of the colonized nation which is necessary and irreplaceable. If the colonial machine is to run smoothly, it includes tram conductors, taxi drivers, miners, dockers, interpreters, nurses, and so on. It is these elements which constitute the most faithful followers of the nationalist parties, and who, because of the privileged place which they hold in the colonial system, constitute also the quote-unquote bourgeois fraction of the colonized people. So we understand that the followers of the nationalist political parties are above all town dwellers, shop stewards, industrial workers, intellectuals, and shopkeepers, all living for the most part in the towns. Their way of thinking is already marked in many points by the comparatively well-to-do class, distinguished by technical advances that they spring from. Here, quote-unquote modern ideas reign. It is these classes that will struggle against obscurantist traditions, that will change old customs, and that will thus enter into open conflict with the old granite block upon which the nation rests. The overwhelming majority of nationalist parties show a deep distrust towards the people of the rural areas. The fact is that as a body, these people appear to them to be bogged down in fruitless inertia. The members of the nationalist parties, town workers, and intellectuals, pass the same unfavorable judgment on country districts as the settlers. But if we try to understand the reasons for this mistrust on the part of the political parties with regard to the rural areas, we must remember that colonialism has often strengthened or established its domination by organizing the petrification of the country districts. Ringed round by marabouts, witch doctors, and customary chieftains, the majority of country dwellers are still living in the feudal manner, and the full power of this medieval structure of society is maintained by the settlers' military and administrative officials. So now the young nationalist middle class, which is above all a class interested in trade, is going to compete with these feudal lords in many and various fields. There are marabouts and medicine men who bar the way to sick people who otherwise could consult the doctors. Oracles which pass judgment and thus renders lawyers useless. Cades who make use of their political and administrative powers to set up in trade or start a new transport service. Customary chiefs who oppose in the name of religion and tradition the setting up of businesses and the introduction of new goods. The rising class of native traders and wholesalers needs the disappearance of these prohibitions and barriers in order to develop. The native customers, the preserve of feudal lords who now become aware that they are more or less forbidden to buy the new products, therefore become a market to be contended for. The feudal leaders form a screen between the young westernized nationalists and the bulk of the people. Each time the elite tries to get through the country of people, the tribal chieftains, leaders, and confraternities and traditional authorities intensify their warnings, their threats, and their excommunications. These traditional authorities, who have been upheld by the occupying power, view with disfavor the attempts made by the elite to penetrate the country districts. They know very well that the ideas which are likely to be introduced by these influences coming from the towns call in question the very nature of unchanging, everlasting feudalism. Thus their enemy is not at all the occupying power, with which they get along on the whole very well, but these people with modern ideas who mean to dislocate the aboriginal society, and who in doing so will take the bread out of their mouths. The westernized elements experience feelings with regard to the bulk of the peasantry which are reminiscent of those found among the town workers of industrialized countries. The history of middle-class and working-class revolutions has shown that the bulk of the peasants often constitute a brake on the revolution. Generally, in industrialized countries, the peasantry as a whole are the least aware, the worst organized, and at the same time the most anarchical element. They show a whole range of characteristics: individualism, lack of discipline, liking for money, and propensities towards a wave of uncontrollable rage and deep discouragement, which define a line of behavior that is objectively reactionary. We have seen that the nationalist parties copy their methods from those of the Western political parties, and also, for the most part, that they do not direct their propaganda toward the rural masses. In fact, if a reasoned analysis of colonized society has been made, it would have shown them that the native peasantry lives against a background of tradition, whereas the traditional structure of society has remained intact. Whereas the industrialized countries, it is just this traditional setting which has been broken up by the progress of industrialization. In the colonies, it is at the very core of the embryonic working class that you find individualistic behavior. The landless peasants, who make up the lumpen proletariat, leave the country districts, where the vital statistics are just so many insoluble problems, rush toward the towns, crowd in tin shack settlements, and try to make their way into ports and cities founded by the colonial domination. The bulk of the country people, for their part, continue to live within a rigid framework, and extra mouths to feed have no other alternative than to emigrate towards the center of the population. The peasant who stays put defends his traditions stubbornly, and in colonized society stands for the disciplined element whose interests lie in maintaining the social structure. It is true that this unchanging way of life, which hangs on like grim death to rigid social structures, may occasionally give birth to movements which are based on religious fanaticism or tribal wars. But in their spontaneous movements, the country people as a whole remain disciplined and altruistic. The individual stands aside in favor of the community. The country people are suspicious of the townsmen. The latter dresses like a European. He speaks the European's language, works with him, sometimes even lives in the same district. So he is considered by the peasants as a turncoat who has betrayed everything that goes to make up the national heritage. The townspeople are, quote, traitors and knaves, end quote, who seem to get on well with the occupying powers and do their best to get on with the framework of the colonial system. This is why you often hear the country people say of town dwellers that they have no morals. Here, we are not dealing with the old antagonism between town and country. It is the antagonism which exists between the native who is excluded from the advantages of colonialism and his counterpart who manages to turn colonial exploitation to his account. What is more, the colonists make use of this antagonism in their struggle against the nationalist parties. They mobilize people of the mountains and up-country dwellers against the townsfolk. They pinch hinterlands against the seaboard. They rouse up the tribespeople. And we need not be surprised to see Kalonji crowned king of Kasai, just as it was not surprising to make some years ago the Assembly of Chiefs of Ghana making Nkrumah dance to their tune. The political parties do not manage to organize the country districts. Instead of using existing structures and giving them a nationalist or progressive character, they mean to try and destroy living tradition in the colonial framework. They believe it lies in their power to give the initial impulse to the nation, whereas in reality the chains forged by the colonial system still weigh down heavily. They do not go out to find the mass of the people. They do not pull their theoretical knowledge to the service of the people. They only try to erect a framework around the people which follows a priori schedule. Thus, from the capital city they will quote-unquote parachute organizers into the villages who are either unknown or too young and who, armed with instructions from the central authority, mean to treat the douar or village like a factory cell. The traditional chiefs are ignored, sometimes even persecuted. The makers of the future nation's history trample unconcernedly over small local disputes, that is to say, the only existing national events, whereas they ought to make a village history, the history of traditional conflicts between clans and tribes, a harmonious whole at one with the decisive action to which they call on the people to contribute. The old men, surrounded by respect in all traditional societies and usually invested with unquestionable moral authority, are publicly held up to ridicule. The occupying powers' local authorities do not fail to use the resentment thus engendered and keep in touch with the slightest decision to adopt by this caricature of authority. Police repression, well informed because it is the basis on precise information, strikes. The parachuted leaders and the consequential members of a new assembly are arrested. Such setbacks confirm the quote-unquote theoretical analysis of the national parties. The disastrous experience of trying to enroll the country's people as a whole reinforces their distrust and crystallizes their aggressiveness towards that section of the people. Even after the struggle for national freedom has succeeded, the same mistakes are made, and such mistakes make for the maintenance of decentralizing and autonomous tendencies. Tribalism in the colonial phase gives way to regionalism in the national phase, and finds its expression as far as institutions are concerned in federalism. But it may happen that the country people, in spite of the slight hold that the nationalist parties have over them, play a decisive part either in the process of the maturing of the national consciousness or through working in with the action of the nationalist parties or less frequently by substituting themselves purely and simply for the sterility of these parties. For the propaganda of the nationalist parties always find an echo in the heart of the peasantry. The memory of the anti-colonial period is very much alive in the villages, where women still croon in their children's ears songs to which the warriors marched when they went out to fight the conquerors. At 12 or 13 years of age, the village children know the names of the old men who were in the last rising, and the dreams they dream in the douars or in the villages are not those of money or of getting through their exams like the children of the towns, but dreams of identification with some rebel or another, the story whose heroic death still today moves them to tears. Just when the national parties are trying to organize the embryonic working class in the towns, we notice certain seemingly completely inexplicable explosions in the country districts. Take, for example, the famous rebellion of 1947 in Madagascar. The colonial authorities were categorical. It was a peasant rising. In fact, we now know that, as usual, things were more complicated than that. During the Second World War, the big colonial companies greatly increased their power and became the possessors of all the land that up to them was still free. At the same time, there was talking of planting the island eventually with Jewish, Kabbalian, and West Indian refugees. Another rumor was equally rife that the whites of South Africa were soon going to invade the island with collusion of the settlers. Thus, after the war, the candidates on the nationalist list were triumphantly elected. Immediately after, organized repression began of the cells of the Mouvement Démocratique de la Rénovation Malgache, or Democratic Movement for the Madagascan Restoration. Colonialism, in order to reach its ends, used the usual traditional methods: frequent arrest, racist propaganda between tribes, and the creation of the party out of the unorganized elements of the lumpen proletariat. This party, with the name of the disinherited Madagascans, gave the colonial authorities, by its distinctly provocative actions, the legal excuse to maintain order. It happened that this frequent operation of liquidating a party which had been set up in advance took on this context gigantic proportions. The rural masses, on the defensive for the last 3 or 4 years, suddenly felt themselves in deadly peril, and decided to oppose colonist forces savagely. Armed with spears, and more often simply with sticks and stones, the people flung themselves into general revolt for national liberty. We know the end of this story. Such armed rebellions only represent one of the means used by the country dwellers to join in the national struggle. Sometimes, when the nationalist party in the towns is tracked down by police repression, the peasants carry on the tradition of urban agitation. News of the regression comes to the country districts in a grossly exaggerated form. The tale runs that the leaders are arrested, that machine gunning is rife, that the town is running red with the blood of Negroes, or that the small settlers are bathing in Arab blood. Thereupon the accumulated exacerbated hate explodes. The neighboring police barracks is captured, the policemen are hacked into pieces, the local schoolmaster is murdered, the doctor only gets away with his life because he was not at home, etc. Pacifying forces are hurried to the spot, and the Air Force bombards it. Then the banner of revolt is unfurled. The old warrior-like traditions spring up again. The women cheer, the men organize and take up positions in the mountains, and guerrilla war begins. The peasantry spontaneously gives a concrete form to the general insecurity, and colonialism takes fright and either continues the war or negotiates. What is the reaction of the nationalist parties to this eruption of the peasant masses into national struggle? We have seen that the majority of nationalist parties have not written into their propaganda the necessity for armed intervention. They do not oppose the continuing of rebellion, but they content themselves with leaving it to the spontaneous action of the country people. As a whole, they treat this new element as some sort of manna fallen from heaven, and pray to goodness that it'll go on falling. They make the most of the manna, but do not attempt to organize the rebellion. They do not send leaders into the countryside to educate people politically, or to increase their awareness, or put the struggle onto a higher level. All they do is hope that, carried onward by its own momentum, the action of the people will not come to a standstill. There is no contamination of the rural movement by the urban movement. Each develops according to its own dialectic. The nationalist parties do not attempt to give definite orders to the country people, although the latter are perfectly ready to listen to them. They offer them no objective. They simply hope that this new movement will go on indefinitely, and that the bombardments will not put an end to it. Thus we see that even when such an occasion offers, the nationalist parties make no use at all of the opportunity which is offered to them to integrate the people of the countryside, to educate them politically, and to raise the level of their struggle. The old attitude of mistrust towards the countryside is criminally evident. The political leaders go underground in the towns, give the impression to the colonists that they have no connection with the rebels or seek refuge abroad. It very seldom happens that when they join the people in the hills, in Kenya for example, during the Mau Mau Rebellion, not a single well-known nationalist declared his affiliation with the movement or even tried to defend the men involved in it. The different strata of the nation never have it out with each other to any advantage. There is no settling of accounts between them. Thus, when independence is achieved, after the repression practiced on the country people, after the entente between colonialism and the national parties, it is no wonder that you find this incomprehension to an even greater degree. The country dwellers are slow to take up the structural reforms proposed by the government and equally slow in following their social reforms, even though they may be very progressive, if viewed objectively, precisely because the people now at the head of affairs did not explain to the people as a whole during the colonial period what were the aims of the party, the national trends, or the problems of international politics. The mistrust which country dwellers and those still living within the feudal system feel towards nationalist parties during the colonial period is followed by a similarly strong hostility during the national period. The colonial secret services, which were not disbanded after independence, keep up the discontentment and still manage to make serious difficulties for the young government. All in all, the government is only being made to pay for its laziness during the period of liberation and its unfailing mistrust of the country people. The nation may as well have reasonable, even progressive head to it. Its body will remain weak, stubborn, and non-cooperative. The temptation, therefore, will be to break up this body by centralizing the administration and surrounding the people by a firm administrative framework. This is one of the reasons why you often hear it said that the underdeveloped countries a small dose of dictatorship is needed. The men at the head of things distrust the people of the countryside. Moreover, this distrust takes on serious proportions. This is the case, for example, of certain governments which, long after national independence is declared, continue to consider the interior of the country as non-pacified area, whereas the chief of state or his ministers only go when national army is carrying out maneuvers there. For all practical purposes, the interior ranks with the unknown. Paradoxically, the national government, in its dealing with the country people as a whole, is reminiscent of certain features of the former colonial power. Quote, "We don't quite know how the mass of these people will react," end quote, is the cry, and the young ruling class does not hesitate to assert that they, quote, "need the thick end of the stick if this country is going to get out of the Middle Ages," end quote. But as we have seen, the offhand way in which the political parties treated the rural population during the colonial phase could only prejudice national unity at the very moment when the young nation needs to get off to a good start. Sometimes colonialism attempts to dislocate or create diversions around the upward thrust of nationalism. Instead of organizing the sheiks and the chiefs against the quote-unquote revolutionaries in the towns, native committees organized the tribes and confraternities into parties. Confronted with the urban party which was beginning to embody the national will and constitute a danger for the colonial regime, splinter groups are born, and tendencies and parties which have their origin in ethnic or regional differences spring up. It is the entire tribe which is turning itself into a political party, closely advised by the colonists. The conference table can now be pulled out. The party which advocates unity will be drowned in the computations of the various splinter groups, while the tribal parties will oppose centralization and unity, and will denounce the party of unity as dictatorship. Later on, the same tactics will be used by the national opposition. The occupying power has made its choice from among the 2 or 3 nationalist parties which led the struggle for liberation. The ways of choosing are well known. When a party has achieved national unanimity and has imposed itself on the occupying power as the sole spokesman of the nation, the colonial powers start complicating maneuverings and delays of the opening of negotiations as much as it ever can. Such a delay will be used to fritter away the demands of this party or get its leaders to put a certain quote-unquote extremist elements into the background. If, on the other hand, no party really succeeds in imposing itself, The occupying power is content to extend privileges to the party which it considers to be the most quote-unquote reasonable. The nationalist parties, which have not taken part in the negotiations, engage in denunciations of the agreement reached between the other party and the occupying power. The party which takes over the reins from the colonists, conscious of the danger with which the extremely demagogical and confused attitude of the rival party threatens it, tries to disband its competitor and condemn it to illegality. The persecuted party has no alternative but to seek refuge in the outskirts of the towns and in the country districts. It tries to rouse the people of the country against the, quote, traitors of the seaboard and corrupt politicians of the capital, end quote. Any excuse is good enough. Religious feeling, innovations made by the new government which break from tradition, and so on. The obscurest tendencies of the country dwellers are exploited to the full. The so-called revolutionary doctrine, in fact, rests on the retrograde, emotional, and spontaneous nature of the country districts. Here and there, it whispered that the mountain is moving, that the countryside is disconnected. It said that a certain place in the police have opened fire on the peasantry, that reinforcements have been sent out, and that the government is on the point of falling. The parties in opposition, since they have no clear program, have no other end in view but to take the place of the governing party, and with this as their goal they place their destiny in the hands of the obscure spontaneous mass of the peasantry. Inversely, it sometimes happens that the opposition no longer relies on support of the country people, but rather on the progressive elements found in the trade unions of the young nation. In this case, the government calls upon the country folk to oppose the demands of the workers, which they denounce as the maneuvers of anti-traditionalist adventures. The facts we have established regarding the political parties are once more observed. Mutatis mutandis on the level of trade unions. In the beginning of the trade union organizations in the colonial territories are regularly local branches of the trade unions of the mother country, and their orders are the echo of those given in the mother country. Once the decisive phase of the struggle for liberation emerges, some native trade unionists will decide upon the creation of national unions. The old structure, imported from the mother country, will suffer heavy losses from the native members deserted. This creating of new unions is a fresh element of pressure in the hands of the populations of the towns upon colonialism. We have seen that the working class in the colonies is an embryonic state and represents that fraction of the people which is the most favored. The national unions are born out of the struggle for independence organized in the towns, and their program is above all a political program and a nationalist program. Such a national union which comes into being during this decisive phase of the fight for independence is, in fact, the legal enlistment of conscious, dynamic nationalist elements. The mass of the country dwellers looked down upon by the political parties continue to keep at a distance. Of course, there will be an agricultural workers' union there, but its creation is simply to supply an answer to the categorical necessity to, quote, present a unified front to colonialism, end quote. The trade union officials who have won their colors in the field of the union organizations of the mother country have no idea how to organize the mass of country people. They have lost all contact with the peasantry, and their primary preoccupation is to enlist dockers, metallurgists, and state-employed gas and electricity workers in their ranks. During the colonial phase, the nationalist trade union organizations constitute an impressive striking power. In the towns, the trade unionists can bring it to a standstill or at any rate slow down at any given moment the colonialist economy. Since the European settlement is often confined to towns, the psychological effects of demonstrations on that settlement are considerable. There is no electricity, no gas, the dustbins are left unemptied, and goods rot in the quays. These little islands of the mother country, which the towns constitute in the colonial structure, are deeply conscious of trade union action. The fortress of colonialism, which the capitalist represents, staggers under their blows. But the quote-unquote interior, the mass country dwellers, knows nothing of this conflict. Thus we see that there is a lack of proportion from the nationalist point of view between the importance of the trade unions and the rest of the nation. After independence, the workers who have joined the unions get the impression that they are living in a vacuum. The limited objective that sets themselves turns out to be, at the very moment that it is attained, extremely precarious, having regard to the immensity of the task of national reconstruction. When faced with the national middle class, whose connections with the government are often closely linked, the trade union leaders discover that they can no longer limit themselves to working class agitation. Isolated by their very nature from the country people, and incapable of giving directions once outside the suburbs, the unions become more and more political in their attitude. In fact, the unions become candidates for governmental power. They try by every means to corner the middle classes. They protest against the maintenance of foreign bases on the national territory. They denounce trade agreements, and they oppose the national government's foreign policy. The workers, now that they have their quote-unquote independence, do not know where to go from there. For the day after independence is declared, the trade unions realize that if their social demands were to be expressed, they would scandalize the rest of the nation. For the workers are in fact the most favored section of the population, and represent the most comfortably off fraction of the people. Any movement starting off to fight for the bettering of living conditions for the dockers and workmen would not only be very unpopular, but also run the risk of provoking the hostility of the disinherited rural population. The trade unions, to whom all trade union activity is forbidden, merely mark time. This unhealthy state of affairs simply shows the objective necessity of a social program which would appeal the nation as a whole. Suddenly, the unions discover that the back country, too, ought to be enlightened and organized. But since at no time they have taken care to establish working links between themselves and the mass of the peasants, and since this peasantry precisely constitutes the only spontaneous revolutionary force of their country, the trade unions will give proof of their inefficiency and find out for themselves the anachronistic nature of the programs. The trade union leaders, steeped in the working class political action, automatically go from there to the preparation of a coup d'etat. But here, again, the back country is left out. This is a limited settling of accounts only between the national middle class and the union workers. The national middle class, taking up the old traditions of colonialism, makes a show of its military and police forces, while the unions organize mass meetings and mobilize tens of thousands of members. The peasants, confronted with this national middle class and these workers who, after all, can eat their fill, look on, shrugging their shoulders, and they shrug their shoulders because they know very well that both sides look on them as make-weight. The unions and the parties or the government, in any kind of immoral Machiavellian fashion, all make use of the peasant masses as blind, inert, tactical force, brute force, as it were. On the other hand, in certain circumstances, the country people are going to intervene in decisive fashion, both in the struggle for national freedom and in the way that the future nation marks out for itself. This phenomenon takes a fundamental importance for the underdeveloped countries. This is why we propose to study it in detail. We have seen that inside the nationalist parties, the will to break colonialism is linked with another quite different will, that of coming to a friendly agreement with it. Within these parties, the two processes will sometimes continue side by side. In the first place, when the intellectual elements have carried out a prolonged analysis of the true nature of colonialism, and of the international situation, they will begin to criticize their party's lack of ideology and the poverty of its tactics and strategy. They begin to question their leaders ceaselessly on crucial points. What is nationalism? What sense do you give this world? What is its meaning? Independence for what? And in the first place, how do you pose to achieve it? They ask these questions and at the same time require that the problems of methodology should be vigorously tackled. They are ready to suggest that electoral resources should be supplemented by all other means. After the first skirmishes, the official leaders speedily dispose of this effervescence, which they are quick to label as childishness. But since these demands are not simply effervescence, nor a sign of immaturity, the revolutionary elements which subscribe to them will rapidly be isolated. The official leaders, draped in their years of experience, will pitilessly disown these, quote, adventurers and anarchists, end quote. The party machine shows itself opposed to any innovation. The revolutionary minority finds itself alone, confronted with leaders who are terrified and worried by the idea that they could be swept away by a maelstrom whose nature, force, or direction they cannot even imagine. The second process concerns the main leaders, or their seconds in command, who are marked out for police repression under colonialists. It must be emphasized that these men have come to the head of the party by their untiring work, their spirit of sacrifice, and a most exemplary patriotism. Such men, who have worked their way up from the bottom, are often unskilled workers, seasonal laborers, or even sometimes chronically unemployed. For them, the fact of militating in national party is not simply taking part in politics. It is choosing the only means whereby they can pass from the status of an animal to that of a human being. Such men, hampered by the excessive legalism of the party, will show within the limits of the activities for which they are responsible a spirit of initiative, courage, and a sense of the importance of the struggle, which mark them out almost automatically as targets for colonialist repression. Arrested, condemned, tortured, finally amnestied, they use their time in prison to clarify their ideas and strengthen their determination. Through hunger strikes and the violent brotherhood of the prison's quicklime, they live on, hoping for their freedom, looking on it as an opportunity to start an armed struggle. But at one and the same time, outside the prison walls, colonialism attacked from all sides, making advances to the nationalist moderates. So we can observe the process whereby the rupture occurs between the illegal and legal tendencies in the party. The illegal minority is made to feel that they are undesirables and are shunned by the people that matter. The legal members of the party come to their aid with great precaution, but already there is a rift between the two tendencies. The illegalists, therefore, will get into touch with the intellectual elements whose attitude they were unable to understand a few years back. And an underground party, an offshoot of the legal party, will be the result of this meeting. But the repression of these wayward elements intensifies as the legal party draws nearer to colonialism and attempts to modify it from the inside. The illegal minority thus finds itself in a historically blind alley. Boycotted by the towns, these men first settle in the outskirts of the suburbs, but the police networks traps them and forces them to leave the towns for good, and to quit the scenes of political action. They fall back toward the countryside and to the mountains, toward the peasant people. From the beginning, the peasantry closes in around them and protects them from being pursued by the police. The militant nationalist who decides to throw in his lot with the country people instead of playing at hide-and-seek with the police in urban centers will lose nothing. The peasant's cloak will wrap around him with the gentleness and firmness that he never suspected. These men, who are in fact exiled into the backwoods, who are cut off from the urban background against which they had defined their ideas of the nation and of the political fight, these men have in fact become masquerades, since they are obliged to move about the whole time in order to escape from the police, often at night, so as to not attract attention. They will have good reason to wander through the country and to get to know it. The cafes are forgotten. So are the arguments about the next elections or spitefulness of some policeman or another. Their ears hear the true voice of the country, and their eyes take in the great and infinite poverty of their people. They realize the precious time that has been wasted in useless commentaries upon the colonial regime. They finally come to understand that the changeover will not be a reform nor a bettering of things. They come to understand with a sort of bewilderment that will from henceforth never quite leave them, that political action in the towns will always be powerless to modify or overthrow the colonial regime. These men get used to talking to the peasants. They discover that the mass of the country people have never ceased to think of the problem of their liberation, except in terms of violence, in terms of taking back the land from the foreigners, in terms of national struggle and of armed insurrection. It is all very simple. These men discover a coherent people who go on living, as it were, statistically, but who keep their moral values and their devotion to the nation intact. They discover a people that is generous, ready to sacrifice themselves completely, an impatient people with a stony pride. It is understandable that the meeting between these militants with the police on their track and these meddlesome masses of people who are rebels by instinct can produce an explosive mixture of unusual potentiality. These men coming from the towns learn their lessons in the hard school of the people, and at the same time these men open classes for the people in military and political education. The people furbish up their weapons, but in fact the classes do not last long, for the masses come to know once again the strength of their own muscles, and push the leaders on to prompt action. The armed struggle has begun. The rising disconcerts the political parties. Their doctrine, in fact, has always affirmed the uselessness of a trial of force, and their very existence is a constant condemnation of all rebellion. Secretly, certain political parties share the optimism of the settlers and congratulate themselves on being well away from this act of madness, which, it's said, will be put down with bloodshed. But once the match is lit, the blaze spreads like wildfire through the whole country. The armored cars and the airplanes do not win through with unqualified success. Faced with the full extent of the trouble, colonialism begins to reflect on the matter. At the very core of the oppressing nation voices are raised and listened to, which draw attention to the gravity of the situation. So this is the exact middle of chapter 2, so we'll continue in a separate video for part 2 of chapter 2.